How's everybody doing? Good? Awesome. So, very generally what I'm going to talk about is what it says up here, in just admission 101, what do colleges look for from prospective applicants. I'm going to try to keep this as broad as possible. My expertise is UVA, of course, and I'm a little biased in that part, I went there. But any questions that you have throughout my talk, I don't want to talk at you guys the entire time. Hopefully we can make this as informative of an introduction, essentially, to the college search and selection process as possible. So to begin, there are over 4,000 colleges, universities, and community colleges in the U.S. Most of the schools require an application for admission, but there are different types of selectivity. As you're going through your college search and selection process, you've probably already seen some of these terms. Like open enrollment. So for community colleges, usually you just need a GED or a high school diploma, and then you're able to take classes there and to enroll as a student. Selectivity comes into play usually with four-year schools, both public and private. Less selective means that schools generally accept most of the applicants that apply, typically 75% or more. Selective means that typically only about half of the students that apply get in. Very selective are schools that tend to accept a large amount of the applicants that apply, but nowhere near a majority, like UVA, for example. We're a very selective institution. In-state, we accept between 40 to 45% of the Virginians that apply, and then out-of-state, we accept 20 to 25% of the out-of-state students. So our overall acceptance rate is roughly 30%. And the most selective are schools like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford that have single-digit acceptance rates, 6, 7, 8%. So extremely tough to get into those schools. But it's definitely helpful when you're going through this process, when you're figuring out where you might want to be for the next 4 years, to pay attention to what type of selectivity and what level of selectivity a school has. So that way you can gauge your chances of getting in on your own, and then you can have a good amount of choices on the opposite end to then use in your decision-making process when you're figuring out where you want to go. As I mentioned, public and private institutions, there are essentially four different types of colleges and universities in the U.S. You have public four-years, which are not the majority numerically of the colleges and universities in the U.S., but they do hold the most students out of, I believe it's the 11 million college students at any given time. Most of those students, roughly 70%, are going to be at public colleges and universities, either four-year or two-year institutions. Private universities tend not to have strict admission barriers for any one set of students. So whether you're applying in Virginia to a private institution like the University of Richmond, or you're applying from DC or Maryland, it doesn't make a difference to the private institution where you're coming from, because you're not tied to any type of maintenance of an in-state population versus an out-of-state population. Public schools, on the other hand, are dedicated to the states within which they reside. So, like the University of Virginia, for example, about 2/3 of our students are coming from the state of Virginia every year. That's something that we abide by as an institution. And you'll see similar numbers from public universities, both in the state of Virginia and outside of it, which means that when you're looking at public institutions, say like UNC Chapel Hill, the University of Michigan, University of California, Berkeley, you will see that their acceptance rates in-state are usually much higher, like UVA's is in-state, than for their out-of-state applicants as well, because they also maintain a certain amount of seats in-state versus out-of-state. Parts of the application, I hope I'll still have you guys with me. I know very much dissecting this, but these are just the different pieces that we're looking for. You know, your high school transcript, summary of all the courses and classes you've taken, how you perform academically, personal information, what's your name, where you live, who are you, who are your parents, what do they do for their work, recommendation letters, some that are required, some that are optional, depends on the school. Essays to get a little more information about yourself. Sometimes it's one essay that you have to write for these applications. Sometimes it's multiple ones. Like UVA, for example, has 2 that are required, 1 that's recommended. Other schools may require 2 or 3. Like UVA, they may require none. It usually depends also on their level of selectivity. It tends to be the more selective that a school is, the more information they want from you in the essay writing process as well. Resumes, it depends on the school. UVA doesn't require it for admission. Some schools may require it. A tip for the seniors, rising juniors and seniors really in the audience, pare down your resumes. You should not have a 10-page resume in high school. It's way too long. Ideally, if you are going to submit a resume to any college or university, focus if you can on getting that down to 1 page. Really, what activities, what involvement has meant the most to you? Where have you developed your interest in those activities the most? Your leadership roles and things like that. A resume is not a summary of everything you've done. It's essentially bullet points. It gives me a snapshot of your involvement throughout high school and the things that have been the most important to you. Interviews, again, for some, not all, UVA actually doesn't conduct interviews for admissions. Some schools require it as a part of the admission process. And for those interviews, you may be going to that college or university to interview with one of the admissions staff members at the school, or you might have a local interview with one of the alumni representatives in the area. And if you're having those interviews, of course, it's always important to show up promptly, on time, well-dressed and well-prepared, because that is an important part of the decision-making process for institutions that have interviews as a part of the admission process. And then finally, of course, application fees or requested fee waivers. You have to have that. Typically, they apply to schools. Some schools offer fee waivers from attending college fairs, much like the one you're attending tonight. So ask around. UVA, as far as fee waiver goes, will take College Board or the NACAC fee waivers as well. And then students can request it outside of that as well. So what do we look for? Very generally, like I mentioned, we're going to request a transcript. And we're looking at what you've done in high school. This is where most colleges start, because as students in high school, this is where you've dedicated the most energy. You're spending 7 or 8 days, not 7 or 8 days, 7 or 8 hours in class every day. And you're dedicating hours after school to homework every night, hopefully. And we're looking to see what that process has been like. How have you challenged yourself? Have you done well in those classes? And how rigorous is your program? The more selective the school is, the more they're going to care about the rigor of your program. So no longer is it strictly about having a certain GPA, which for the parents of the audience is maybe more familiar to you when you were looking at colleges or when you went to college yourself. At that time, it was more about the GPA and what you had in high school. But now it's more the strength of the program and the grades that have been earned alongside the strength of the program. So a combination. And what the schools use in this determination, in this part of the review, is what's called your high school profile. How many of the people in this audience have looked at the profile for Monticello? Show of hands. Okay. For those that have, great job. For those that haven't, still have time. And the reason I recommend this is because this is what we're looking at on the table. This is how we get a snapshot of what is available in the high school, of the AP or dual enrollment classes that are available. For some schools that offer IB, much the same. We look at the demographics of the high school, at typical academic performance, at what the average SAT or ACT scores are in the school, and some profiles will also include the colleges and universities that students have been admitted to in the past, and sometimes they'll bold or highlight the schools that students are currently attending from the previous year. So if you haven't seen your high school profile, definitely look at it, because that just gives you, I think, a better sense of what we see on our end. And especially if you're in your freshman or sophomore year, you're getting an early start on this process, it gives you good insight into how to prepare yourself over the next 3 or 4 years in order to make yourself a competitive applicant, especially for the more selective schools that are out there to apply to. And on the subject of standardized tests, there are a few different ones that you can take. The most well-known are the SAT and the ACT. They test you really in different ways. Most schools do not have a preference. Like UVA, we don't have a preference as to which test you submit to us. The SATs are a critical thinking test. So they test you in that way. The ACTs are subject-based tests. So they test you in that way. And depending on how you think about things, how you perceive things, how you take in information, and how you then use that information intellectually, you can test very differently on the SATs or the ACTs. And I've seen very different scores from the same student on one versus the other. And for schools like UVA, they don't have a preference. We're looking for the best scores from either one of those tests. Some schools require the SAT subject test. They used to be called the SAT 2s. UVA strongly recommends it, but honestly, it doesn't matter. Essentially for us, we would like to see it if the scores help you. So just pay attention as you're going through the application and admission process, as you're looking for schools to try to identify. Look at the language they use around standardized testing. Like for UVA, we strongly recommend it, but it's in no way required to be competitive for admission, whereas other schools will require you to take the SAT subject test, and they may require that you take 2 or 3 subject tests at that point. So just keep that in mind. And I put the TOEFL up there, because sometimes I run into students from other countries, and their first language was not English, and if you're a student like that, then you can take the TOEFL as well, as far as standardized testing goes. But that's just a snapshot of what's available. Most colleges and universities use standardized testing just to see where a student fits in a broader group. Like in Virginia, the way we use SATs or ACTs broadly is just to see where a student's at with standardized testing. It gives us a snapshot to see how well they do within a controlled environment for 4 hours on a Saturday morning. With that being said, some students do very well on standardized testing, but if you are in a situation where you're not a great test taker, not the end of the world, because most schools will have general ranges for where the middle 50% of their applicants are at. If you're in that range, great. If you're not, it can still be okay. Because usually what schools also don't do is report their minimums, because usually there really aren't any. Students tend to self-select themselves out of that in that case. But as you're going through, as you're planning on when to take the SATs or ACTs, I would recommend that in your junior year, you try to take at least one or the other. It's okay if you haven't, but ideally if you're looking at applying to schools in your senior year, you'll at least have one of those testings out of the way. Schools also superscore for these tests, and if you're unfamiliar with the term, what superscoring means is that for the SAT, schools take the highest critical reading, math, and writing score, no matter when you took that test. So if you take the SAT at the end of your junior year, and again in September of your senior year, and again in November, and you get your highest critical reading score the first time, the highest math score the second, the highest writing score the third, that's what the school's going to look at as far as the decision-making process. So they're looking for the best scores. And pay attention to what the schools request from you as well. Some schools want to see all of your testing, no matter when it was from. UVA is in that category. We ask that you submit all of your testing to us, and then we determine what's the best for you. Some schools only want your highest scores. So depending on what the schools are asking for, what they're looking for in the application process, just make sure you're keeping track of that. If anything, by this point in the admission process, I hope you would have an Excel sheet or Google spreadsheet in order to keep track of all the deadlines and different things the schools ask for. It's just a good way to be organized, especially as deadlines start rapidly approaching when you're in your senior year of high school. Extracurricular activities, they take on many different things for students in high school. The most important thing I want to emphasize as I talk about this is that within athletics, if you are athletically inclined, and you've always been involved in sports, it doesn't matter whether it's football, basketball, soccer, lacrosse, so on and so forth, whatever that interest is of yours, if you've dedicated a lot of energy and passion to it, that's great. Whether or not you want to be a Division I, II, or III athlete in college, that isn't necessarily important unless you want to be an athlete in college, and then your performance on the field or on the court is important. But beyond that, for athletics, we're just looking for what experience you gain from it, what leadership skills or teamwork skills you develop from it. Community service operates much in the same way. I often get asked the question, because sometimes high schools will require a certain amount of community service hours for graduation. If you're in that boat here, it doesn't honestly matter to me on my end, because I'm not looking for a certain number of community service hours. I'm looking for the experience that you gain from it. Has it enlightened you in a certain way? Has it changed how you see or perceive the world through what you've been involved in? And if it has, if it's been a useful experience for you, great. If it hasn't, that's okay too. Student organizations, as far as what you've been involved in high school, student government, any other clubs or organizations that you're part of, language club here, one of the Rossi branches as well. If you had student employment, like you worked a part-time job either during the year, or if you had internships during the summer, or a part-time job during the summer, and beyond, really extracurriculars can take up any imaginable activity outside of high school, outside of what's going on in the classroom. They can be academically related, and they might not be. The ways that you can include this information on the application are usually within a list on the application itself, and then within a resume if you need a little more room to go a little more in depth. But again, focus on what's most important to you here. Usually what schools will say, and this is on, I always say with UVA, it doesn't matter to me what you're involved with. What matters to me in that respect is the experience that you have. You know, what have these activities, what have these involvements meant to you in high school? Have you grown through them? Have you learned from them? Have they challenged you in some ways? If they have, they've been valuable experiences for you. So, very commonly, I think the more selective institutions are in their admission process, the more students worry about, you know, I need to be student body president, or I need to do thousands of hours of community service, or I need to raise tens of thousands of dollars for philanthropy. Some students write books in high school. I don't know how to do it. I don't know if I could write a book now. That's an impressive endeavor. If you're in that category, kudos to you. But there's no right way to approach this unless it's not being honest to who you are and not being true to your interests outside the classroom. And as long as you're following by that gut feeling of what feels right for you to be involved in, whether it's band or sports or anything else, whatever those interests are, the arts, whatever that is for you, whatever helps you juggle what's going on in high school, from academics, from balancing friendships and life as it comes along, that is what we want to see from you. So there's no right thing, no wrong thing, but just make sure you focus as you're going through this process, and you really talk to us about what's been the most important to you and what's been the most to you. Recommendation letters are another part of our process. They come primarily from guidance counselors and teachers. Most schools will require one or two from those two categories. Beyond that, additional letters can come from anywhere. Pay, again, careful attention to what the schools request. Some will only require one from a guidance counselor, maybe one or two from a teacher. UVA falls into that category, but then you can submit anything you want to beyond that. With recommendation letters, it's not necessary to get an alumnus of that institution to write a letter for you. You just got to be careful about that. Sometimes alumni, when they're writing letters to their alma maters, the schools that they went to, they might spend a little more time talking about where they've been and what they've done since they left than the student they're writing about. So just be careful with that. As far as recommendation letters go for guidance counselors, they give you the big picture. What has the student been doing over the last 4 years in the context of the high school? They set up what I'm going to be reading about in that high school profile that I mentioned earlier, and they tell me how you've done and how you performed very broadly. So for most colleges and universities, you do not have to know your guidance counselor on a first name basis. We run into these questions a lot when counselors retire, or they switch grades, or something gets shuffled around and a student ends up in their senior year and they're stressing out because they have a new counselor. And they're like, are they going to be able to adequately represent me in the college admission process? And the answer, as long as you're communicating with them, is yes. Because they just give me the big picture. They allow me to look from 10,000 feet at what's going on very broadly around you. Your teachers is where I'm looking for the personal stuff. They're going to be able to tell me how you have performed academically, how you contribute in the classroom, how you add to the discussions that are going on between you and your teachers and your peers. So they allow me to picture you in the classroom at my institution. So the personal relationship, the value from that comes from your teacher. And it's not necessary to have a teacher in your senior year write a recommendation letter for you, if anything. For those of you in your freshman, sophomore, or junior years of high school, by the end of your junior year, I'd recommend that you ask your teachers, whoever, in whatever subjects you're the strongest in, or whatever teachers you work the best with, hopefully within one of the core subjects like English, social studies, mathematics, life science, or foreign language, that you ask them to write a letter for you. So that way, they have that summer break between junior and senior year to really think about how they want to describe you. What anecdotes could they add into their letter that give me a picture of what you've been doing in the classroom, how you've contributed, what value you could add to the institutions that you're applying to. Because the longer you wait, the closer you get to the deadlines. Like a lot of schools have deadlines in November. If you're asking towards the end of October, you're going to get a very general letter. Because teachers won't have enough time to put everything that they want to into that letter for you. So just be aware of deadlines. And again, for the rising seniors or eventual seniors in the audience, you also want to be cognizant of the time that you're going to have to set aside to get through all these applications, to make sure you get all these recommendation letters in, to still do well in high school, your senior year, but also to enjoy the time you have left in high school at that point. It's a very stressful time of the year, so the more you can think about this process in advance, the more you can plan ahead, the more you can keep track of deadlines when you have to submit stuff, and the further in advance that you ask for stuff, the easier this process is for you, because it can be stressful. As far as essays go, they're typically limited to a certain word count. Some will limit you to 250, 500, typically no more than 1,000 words. For some schools, this could be your way to introduce yourself. I like the essays because it is an opportunity for you to allow your voice to come through as the applicant. Because by the time you're writing these essays in your senior year, pretty much everything else has been decided. All the classes you've taken from your 9th grade through the 11th grade will determine what you can take in the 12th grade. Your academic performance puts you in a certain position competitively. Hopefully your standardized testing will be complete early on in your senior year. And extracurriculars, you've been involved in some things. There's not really anything you can pick up unless it's a prestigious honor within your high school in your senior year. That'll affect how we see your extracurricular activities. So your essays are really an opportunity to say, this is where I am now. This is what I'm thinking about. This is what I envision for my future. And this is where I want, how I want to get there. And this is how your institution can help you with that. And this is what I can give to your institution. So that is a unique opportunity in your senior year, just to take the opportunity for self-reflection, to see where you're at, and to consider where you're going. They may be required or may be optional. The more selective schools get, if you have the opportunity to write an optional essay, write it. Because the more selective schools get, the more information that you provide them through the avenues that they give you to provide information, the more competitive you can be, and the more well-rounded picture they can get of you within the decision process as well. The importance of choosing your topic really depends on the school. I know a lot of times I've done essay writing workshops in the past. I've sat in on them as well. And a lot of times one of the common things I hear is stay away from anything controversial. Stay away from anything political. Stay away from anything religious. If you have a strong faith, no matter what that is, if you're interested in politics, and very pertinently so, if you want to share your personal story, even if it might be a little controversial, even if it might rub some people the wrong way, it's a piece of you. And if it's one of the more prominent pieces of who you are as a person, that's something valuable to share. Now, it's one thing to pick a controversial topic and write well about it. It's another thing to pick something controversial and just write something that just rubs people the wrong way through this process. So be careful about it, consider it, but depending on the school, like UVA, for example, no topic is off limits. If you're applying to a private religious institution in the U.S., you might want to talk about your faith, because that's going to be a valuable part of the application review process for them, no matter whether your faith is the one that the institution has as its foundation or not. So keep that in mind. And then drafts. You want multiple drafts of your essays. Please don't submit the first drafts, because we can tell on our end, usually because there are typos that you don't expect to be there. I would recommend getting not only your English teachers to proofread your essays. That's very common to see students do that in their senior year. That's okay, because they help make sure you structure things properly. They can check for the spelling, grammar errors that you may miss. But get your friends to read your essays. For the students in the audience, you may hesitate, but get your parents to read them. Because sometimes, one, is great for your parents to see where you're at in your senior year, what you're thinking about, where you're thinking about going. Because sometimes it's a very enlightening process for them too. Because they find out things about you that they might not have known before, but they might not have known that much about. And then I recommend your friends, because those are the people that know you very well. And they may know you almost as well as you know yourself. And if your best friend of however many years can read your college essay, and then they look at you and say, you know what, this is you. Like, you might not be the smartest person in the world, but you're intelligent. Or you might not be the most gifted athlete you've ever seen, but you're a very dedicated athlete. And that comes through in your essay. And that's great. On the other hand, if your best friend of however many years looks at you like you're crazy because of what you've written, and they're like, who is this? I've never met this person. I don't know who you're talking about. You might want to think about rewriting what you've written. Because if your best friend of however many years, or your parents, or your teachers, don't get you and who you are through reading your essays, there's no way that someone on my side of the table is going to be able to do that. So just keep that in mind. Multiple drafts. Usually colleges will, if they're posting their applications online, will post those in July or August before your senior year begins. If there are paper applications, those usually are available at the end of your junior year. So you have time. Take advantage of that summer between your junior and senior year to get an early start on this college application process. Because again, the more work you get out of the way before you start your senior year, when you're really having to walk down and make sure you keep your grades up, and you're probably taking the most challenging classes you've ever taken in high school, the more work you get out of the way for these college applications, the easier it is going to be for you during your senior year. Some colleges require interviews. Like I mentioned, UVA doesn't, but again, for the schools that do, it's an important part of the decision-making process. So make sure you do your research. If there's a particular program of interest at the university, I think it's very unreasonable for you as a student to be able to go in and know everything about a particular institution when you're going in for an interview. But say you have an interest in engineering or the arts, and it's always been a strong interest of yours, dig into that material that's available in the school. Really focus in and research that one aspect of that school, so that way when you go in, you can really talk about that. And the passion for that academic interest or that broader interest in the school will come through in the interview. Practice your interview. Try not to go in cold to this process. Get friends to talk to you through different questions. And really get a feel for the process, because again, it can be an important part of the decision-making process. So the more prepared you are before going in, the less stressful it will be when you're going through that interview process. But also the better it will work out for you on the opposite end of it. And again, they can take place at the college or university that you're applying to, or they may be taking place in your hometown with some of the alumni representatives that live in the area. They can be proctored in that way. And again, they can be a part of the decision-making process. So different types of applications. Already mentioned paper and online. Some of the common online applications are the common application, the Westbridge application. Pay attention to how schools ask that you apply. Every year we still get students asking to submit paper applications to UVA. As of this point, we are at 99.999% online application process for our school. There are some extreme circumstances where we accept a paper application. Like if your computer crashes and it's unrecoverable and you just need to get it in. That kind of thing. So pay attention to how they ask for you to apply. Pay attention to the deadlines as a part of this process. And give yourself enough time to work through this. Because while you're filling out basic demographic background information about yourself, like your name, where you live, and all these things, it's stuff that you know. But if you wait until the last minute through this process, if you're not giving yourself enough time, and you're sitting and looking at 5, 6, 7 or more applications, it starts to add up pretty quickly. So again, give yourself time, look at what application your school requires, and then just make sure you're giving yourself the appropriate amount of time to move through it. And when should you apply? Depends on the school. There are early admission processes, there's regular admission, there's rolling admission, and then there's open enrollment. For early admission, the things you want to pay attention to is whether or not a school has early decision as a program. If they have that as a part of the admission process, know that that is binding, which means if you're accepted early decision to a school, you got to go there, no matter what the financial aid package is. So if you want to apply to a school ED, make sure that you really want to go there like 180%. So far we are 100% that that is your top choice school.